Thrilled to have Audrey Friedrichsen. As I mentioned, Audrey was the author of a paper that really covers the different issues on citing these types of citing decisions. Audrey is a land use and environmental advocacy attorney for Scenic Hudson. She's been at Scenic Hudson for 6 years. She's a member of the policy, advocacy, and outreach team there, which works to safeguard the environmental and economic resources of the Hudson River Valley. Audrey's current focus is on smart solar energy planning and development. She provides legal support to other Scenic Hudson program teams, as well as the Scenic Hudson Land Trust. Audrey has a JD and an LLM from the Elizabeth Hobb School of Law at Pace University and a BS from Cornell University. Prior to joining Scenic Hudson, she practiced municipal land use environmental law at a private law firm. Audrey was the principal author of this document, which we're going to share with you after via email. It's called Clean Energy, Green Communities, a Guide to Citing Renewable Energy in the Hudson Valley. I'm going to pull up Audrey's presentation and unmute Audrey.
All right, slide number 1. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the Connecticut Energy Network for inviting me to speak today. I see I have quite a big chunk of time available on the agenda. And as Mark mentioned, this is something I've been working on for quite a number of years, and that means I can also chat on and on and on about it. So I will try and get through this presentation, and then we can maybe have a little bit of Q&A. We'll leave it up to you guys how you're going to organize it. So as Mark said, I am an attorney with Scenic Hudson. We're an environmental organization based in the city of Poughkeepsie in the Hudson Valley of New York. And I am talking to you today from the city of Beacon, which is a small little city just south of Poughkeepsie. And it's a really great place to live. I live right on Main Street. Everything is very close, but they're also cutting street trees today. So hopefully the noise outside my window won't be too disturbing for everybody, and everyone would be able to hear me as we go through. So next slide, please. So Scenic Hudson, for those of you that aren't familiar, we are a 50-plus-year-old environmental organization, like I said, based in the Hudson Valley. This snapshot here is of a mountain called Storm King Mountain in the Hudson River Fjord, we call it. And many years ago, there was a proposal by Con Ed to chop off the top of this mountain and create a renewable energy facility, a pumped hydro storage facility. And a group of folks got together to oppose that because of the impacts that would have on the river, the fish in the river, as well as this stunning view shed that we have here. And they called themselves the Scenic Hudson Preservation League. And the lawsuit that came out of that and decisions that had to be made really was the birth of environmental law in the United States and led to the National Environmental Policy Act. It required alternatives analysis for projects that are proposed, which might be an issue that you come up with for solar projects and other renewables that are proposed in Connecticut. And also many groups grew out of it. And Scenic Hudson exists today. We do parks, we conserve land with our land trust, and then we also do a lot of advocacy. And so my work has been focusing on smart renewable energy siting, but we also oppose not smart things like repowering of gas-fired power plants, oil pipelines, and of course one of our signature issues that we've been working on is the cleanup of PCBs in the Hudson River. So that's just a little snapshot of Scenic Hudson and what we do. Next slide, please. We have long prided ourselves on our advocacy being very science-based. And the other thing we really work to do is to provide tools and resources and information to others, to people, to residents, to partners, in order to be able to implement the work that we try and achieve. And we had recently undergone a strategic planning exercise and really thinking about how we evolve our work to address emerging issues. And the reason why we're all here today, of course, is because the siting of renewable energy in the interest of shifting our energy supply, which we know we need to do not only to green our energy supply, but also to electrify our transportation and our housing, which is an even greater source and emitter of greenhouse gases than the electricity generation itself. So this emerging issue, we looked at it as an opportunity to really strengthen resiliency. As I mentioned, we are also a land trust. We're a conservation organization, and we approach our land conservation strategically in order to identify those lands that, not only protect historic, scenic view sheds, but also provide things like carbon sequestration, or will be useful in terms of adapting or absorbing sea level rise. We also help with community planning. And so we really thought hard about what our, as we really recognize climate change, and both mitigating and adapting to climate change is becoming sort of mission critical for our organization. What is it that we need to do? Next slide, please. So as we thought about this strategic planning and what our organization can do, at the same time, at the state level, the context that we're working in, which I think is similar to the context that you all are working in Connecticut now, is that the state has really moved forward with renewable energy planning, targets, goals, all in the interest of greenhouse gas emissions. So just really quickly, in New York, we now have, it's codified in state law that we want to have 70% of our energy come from renewable generation by the year 2030, and 100% of it be clean by 2040, and that's codified in what's called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So as a lawyer, you'll hear me talking a little bit about the laws that we're working in here. And that law also, in addition to setting those sort of universal 70 by 30 standards, also set out a few kind of programmatic targets. And I'm going to start throwing out some technical terms here of things like gigawatts and megawatts. And what that refers to is, basically the energy generating capacity that we have built on the ground. And they set a goal of 6,000 megawatts of what's called distributed solar. So that's mostly behind the meter solar, like rooftop or community solar projects. Also 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, which I'm sure is an issue for you folks in Connecticut and your shore communities as well. And also a 3 gigawatt storage goal. And one of the things we hear a lot is that as we add renewable energy to the grid, which is our energy system, what it does is it creates some issues because that is an intermittent energy source. And so how do we make sure that the energy is available when we turn the light switch? And so storage has a big role in that. And that's, all of these things bring with them land use issues. And then of course, the other piece of the puzzle are large scale land-based renewable energy. In New York, we have some wind upstate, but the thing that we're seeing now is large-scale solar. So while all of these incentives, these targets, these goals, these statutes are in place at the state level, of course that has ramifications for us at the very local level, for municipal governments, for land trusts, for residents, and for groups such as the Connecticut Energy Network and others that are going to be dealing with the actual impacts on the grounds of the amount of build out that it's going to take to achieve these targets. So, related to our strategic planning and our interest in ensuring resiliency, and this goes back to one of Mark's first comments as he introduced the day for us, is, how do we respond? How do we achieve an acceleration of renewable energy, which we recognize is necessary, a transition to do that, to reduce greenhouse emissions and deal with climate change. But how do we do that responsibly? And so our goal at Scenic Hudson, our vision for the Hudson Valley in particular, which is sort of our footprint, our jurisdiction and the area in which we work, is we want to make a model of how a region responds to climate change. We know it needs to be powered by renewable energy. We want to be a low carbon region. We know this transition has to happen rapidly. But how do we do it in a way, as Mark mentioned, to protect scenic, historic, agricultural, environmental, and economic resources? These resources are not just natural, they're not just agricultural, but they're economic, right? They are our ag industry, they're our tourism industry. There are services provided by the biodiversity and the wetlands that we have in our valley. And so how do we protect the value of that? And as we started out the day, I know Mark mentioned the idea of balancing, right? How do we achieve both of those things at the same time? And so I think the idea that I would like to throw out there for discussion today, and relating back to our main goal for the day, which is to make sure that we're being proactive, that we've had these discussions ahead of time, that we're planning, that we have an idea of what's coming, where we think it should go. Maybe rather than simply balancing, maybe what we should try and think about is how we achieve win-win situations. And I think the folks that are going to be speaking later today, the developers, I think that's their interest. They want to smooth their glide path to getting permits. And so they recognize that they need to demonstrate that not only are we getting renewable energy, but there are other community benefits that come from that. And then Lexi will be talking about solar grazing. And this is another idea. How can we get a win-win situation as opposed to having solar here and farming there? How can we achieve both at the same time and maximize our efficiencies? And then when it comes to community discussion of this, right? Really finding ways to educate people, inform them of the benefits and the ramifications of renewable energy build out, and then identify the solutions, right, with input from everybody, because that's critical, right? Making sure the information is available, making sure there's transparency, it builds trust among everybody in this entire process, making people aware and finding the solutions, and then adopting the strategies to achieve those win-win situations. So that's really where I've been thinking in my last 3-4 years of working on this. This is coming. There are incentives, there's targets. This technology is getting cheaper. So not only are there, statutes and policies in place, but the market is heading in this direction. And so, rather than hiding your head in the sand and saying, I don't want to look at solar and having opposition and conflict, let's see if we can talk about this ahead of time and figure out how to achieve mutual benefits. So next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of the document that I put together. It's actually a 30+ page book. As you can tell, I talk a lot. I also write a lot here. And so it's already 2 years ago now that, in the interest of setting forth a set of principles for people to think about and ways to both site and design renewable energy projects, and solar in particular, because in the Hudson Valley, at least, that is the resource that we have the most of. We don't have, that much wind. So it's solar that we're looking at for the most part. What are the principles that we can look to as sort of a basis, a starting baseline for siting and designing these projects in order to start the conversation and, you know, start to think about how we can find those mutually beneficial situations, right? We published this in March of 2018. We held a symposium on the very same day where we had a lot of the same conversations that we are having here today. So even though it's, you know, 2 years later, it's good to see that these conversations are spreading out among our region, our tri-state region, even the country. And so we really wanted to set forth, you know, these set of principles, have pillars. Well, this is the pillar of what Scenic Hudson is working on as a suite of tools and basis for our advocacy. And so this is really, you know, hopefully the audience of this is folks like yourselves, you know, local planners, developers themselves, residents, in thinking about where we should put these kinds of projects. And in addition to this kind of local level education and information advocacy, we have also been participating in the state level review and approval of very large scale projects that are proposed that raise a lot of these siting issues, right? And so our advocacy there is grounded in our principles that are set forth in this document. And then also as the state moves forward, and I don't know if anybody has been paying attention to what's been going on in New York for this past year. Just recently, we adopted a new siting law for the process by which very large scale projects, renewable energy projects, are going to get sited, all in the interest of really accelerating that development, trying to clear the process. Because so far, even though we have had a 50 by 30 goal and we now have this 70 by 30 goal, the amount of projects that have actually been permitted and constructed in New York is very, very minimal. We do have some large scale wind projects, but you know, there is concern based on delays, costs, opposition in the process that our renewable energy targets won't be met. So we have been really focusing on how it is that you provide information and educate and give tools to folks to help with the decision making and figuring out how we really best integrate these projects into the landscape. And so our approach to that, next slide please, is not really a new idea. It's a phrase that we sort of adopted, this idea of being smart from the start, right? So we have a set of siting principles, and the whole purpose here is to try and find places, you know, and identify the strategies for how we avoid conflicts right at the outset, right? And what that should do, hopefully, is streamline review and approvals and reduce delays, reduce costs for developers, and you know, ultimately help us achieve our renewable energy goals. And my next two slides are sort of similar here, but the idea is, you know, you need to adopt clear principles and strategies to do that. So everybody has a baseline and an understanding of the framework in which we're operating. And so this is just an overview of our principles of solar siting, but they're sort of two sides of a coin. One is prioritize previously disturbed areas, right? So find the opportunity areas. Where are the parking lots? Where are the rooftops? Where are the closed mines? Where are the brown fields where we can put solar energy projects in a way that reuses the built environment and minimizes conflicts that way? And then secondly, we need to address some of the thornier issues and find ways to protect our agricultural resources, right? Can we do that with co-location or putting in pollinator-friendly habitat? And then we also are interested in protecting our scenic views, our historic resources, our ecological resources. And from Scenic Hudson's perspective, right, our DNA is in achieving those purposes. How do we now bring into our mission area the goal of accelerating renewable energy development, but at the same time protecting all of these things that we have spent the last 50 years working to protect? And just really quickly, as a good example here, this picture on the top is of a building located in Kingston, New York. It is, I think it's an insurance company or something that occupies that building. And the project on top is actually a dual-sided solar project. That's why the roof is painted white. So this thing generates energy from both sides. And not only does it provide energy to the building, it also is a community solar project, so others have subscribed to get the benefits on their bills of the energy produced by this project. So those kinds of ideas to try and maximize efficiencies, and like, you know, it's almost too obvious, right? Like, of course, this is what we're going to do. So I'm just going to go through a little bit more detail, some of our principles of solar siting, which are in that document, and I have the URL for it. I think Mark said he's going to share it as well. So next slide, please. So, you know, I kind of think of this as rule number 1, prioritizing development on previously disturbed areas. So I just mentioned this a little bit, but, you know, it seems self-evident that this is something that we should do, right? Is use the built environment and figure out how to put things in like parking canopies, rooftop solar. And so just not to beat a dead horse here, but what are some of the benefits of doing that, right? If you clean up and reuse contaminated or other previously disturbed properties, it, you know, can preserve areas that now don't become sites for solar. They can help to reduce blight, right? If you're going to use a brown field or something like that. And then it can help to increase property values in the area surrounding it. And then there's always job creation, right? Not only in the temporary construction of a project like this, but in the supply chain, right? So, you know, a lot of times somebody hears a project is coming and they are concerned with all of these impacts. And so knowing what the benefits of something is helpful in terms of, you know, messaging the situation and trying to make people understand the situation from both sides, right? So the other benefits of using previously disturbed areas, obviously it reduces development pressure on agricultural lands and open space. And then, you know, the idea of co-location, right? Siting renewable energy with existing land uses like the picture here, putting a parking canopy in also helps to reduce development impacts, you know. And then this example here we put in, I don't know if you can see it, our illustrator gave us some car chargers. Hopefully everybody can still hear me because I think the tree chipper is going on outside. And, you know, so you've got renewable energy, you've got protection of the cars from sun and snow, you've got car charging, and then also, you know, this can be the basis of something like a microgrid. Next slide, please. So the issue of agricultural lands and solar in particular is a very difficult one because, of course, right, farmers have already figured out where the flat, cleared, sunny lands are, and that's where solar is usually looking to be sited. So, as I mentioned, you know, the idea of balancing, how do we align policy, right? I'm sure Many of the states here in the Northeast, New York, Connecticut included, we have agricultural protection policies, but now we have renewable energy generation policies. And how do we align those policies, and how do we find the solutions to making sure that that we don't result in conflicts here. So some of the principles of siting on agricultural lands are, to the extent possible, avoid disturbing active production, avoid the most important soils, which are classified, consider regional and broader impacts, right? If you start to replace agriculture with renewable energy, what does that do in terms of maybe eroding the agricultural system in a region or in a county or in an agricultural district more broadly? So the idea is to find the places where maybe the soils are more marginal, or it's not an active production, to place your solar, and then maximize places where you can do both agricultural production and solar at the same time. And I think Lexi will talk about that a little bit more.
We can go to the next slide. And I think it wasn't such a bad thing that we heard from the developers and their perspectives, and the site constraints and the things that they consider when siting projects. And also, it's very obvious that they do take into consideration issues like these siting principles, because again, it's in their interest to try and site and design projects in the ways that reduce conflicts, that have the least impact, in order, in the interest of really reducing costs and delays and streamlining their permitting process. And I know there was I think there was a question I did type into the chat box, the distinction between Connecticut and New York. As Gina was just talking about on the last slide there, it's your siting board that has jurisdiction over projects 1 megawatt and above, which is quite different than in New York, where every municipality, 1,600 of them in New York, has home rule authority to adopt zoning, and they have authority over projects up to 25 megawatts. So it's a very different situation, and Gina mentioned that, it's up to developers whether or not they comply with local zoning, and we had a bit of a conversation in preparation for today, and it sounds like, again, in the interest of trying to smooth the path and demonstrate benefits and well-sited projects, so maybe developers in Connecticut do take into consideration local zoning, and so towns and municipalities should think about adopting that. So just really quickly, I think one thing I would like to talk about is Scenic Views. This is one area of controversy, especially in New York and in the Hudson Valley. You hear from people, we just don't want to, we don't want to look at this. I'm all for renewable energy, but I don't want to look at solar. And so it does result in some soul searching here and some difficult questions. And, we make a recommendation in our principles that you should try and site and design to avoid impacts to designated scenic areas. So one of the questions is, what scenic areas are you going to protect? Are they, publicly designated historic sites and view sheds? In New York, we have scenic areas of statewide significance that are dedicated. Or are you going to require that developers fully screen projects from every road, right? And so this is an area where public participation and input, I think, is very important. And a discussion and some soul searching needs to be done in terms of, how much cost are you going to impose on a development in terms of making it fully invisible and maybe even, shaded and impossible versus letting a project go forward. Next slide. Historic resources are obviously important. Just wanted to point out that there are resources out there online, the National Park Service and others, have, they've developed some pretty specific guidelines for how you can do something like put solar on a historic building, which can help increase its efficiency, but doing it in a way that doesn't impact the integrity of it. And next slide, ecological resources. We heard Chris talk about this quite a bit, right? The first thing they look at are things like vernal pools and wetlands. They consider steep slopes. We obviously want to site projects in a manner that protects those important ecological resources, forests that, can do a considerate amount of carbon sequestration. I think studies show that many times, depending on the quality of the forest, even if some trees are removed, that a solar project in terms of GHG emissions comes out to be a net benefit. So I just wanted to, going back to zoning on the next slide here, in Scenic Hudson's efforts to create resources for folks, as I mentioned, our principles and siting guide are already a couple of years old now. And this is, probably maybe more relevant in New York, but at the same time, as municipalities on the ground are dealing with these projects coming into their communities, we are working on a set of recommendations and best practices for local zoning. And, just a few points here out of almost a step-by-step guide is, come up with a policy, right? Where, come up with a pro-solar policy, right? You want to see solar, but you want to see it well sited. See what kind of barriers are already in place. A couple of things that are very important, being able to define and know the market, know what projects are coming here. In New York, it's, there are interconnection requirements, there are permitting regulations, there are incentives, there's tax credits, and those things result in sort of these different buckets of projects, right? Whether they're a rooftop residential or they are like a commercial, industrial, right? It's on the roof of a big box store or a manufacturing facility, or it's a community solar project around 5 megawatts. And in New York, we use a rule of thumb that 5 to 10 acres is necessary for ground-mounted solar per megawatt. Or it's a very large project. Sort of know the market that's out there, know what's coming, and then you can talk about what it is, understand what its potential impacts are, and do some smart planning for that. So this is, going to be probably more New York focused, but, keep in mind this is hopefully going to be coming out soon. We're a little delayed due to COVID. And then next slide, considering the idea of landscape level planning, it's maybe the horse is a little bit out of the barn, since we, in many states, we already have these renewable energy targets. The markets are taking off. Developers are proposing projects. But, people are thinking a little bit now about, how do we do the grid studies and where are the upgrades necessary to meet our targets? And then, where is it that these projects, can we already sort of beforehand find areas where it makes sense to put these projects? Next slide. So in the interest of that, we're creating a second tool. It's going to be a web-based tool. It's a GIS data layers, so you'll be able to put on a map. And this is Hudson Valley based right now, so it's just going to cover the 10 counties of the Hudson Valley, but we are also going to be preparing a replication guide where hopefully people can learn about how we put this tool together and then recreate it in other regions of the country. And, this in line with the principles that we talked about, it's sort of a planning process. Where are the current development patterns? Where are those opportunity areas, the rooftops, the parking lots, the brownfields? Where are the low impact, low conflict sites, right? Which are probably the same sites that developers are looking for, And then also, where is the interconnection? Chris mentioned something called a hosting capacity map, which is a map of the distribution lines, the ones that you see along the street, and how much room is on there to allow a project to connect in without adversely impacting the system, or where even are the very high voltage lines, the transmission lines, where bigger projects will connect. And so this is a product that we are going to also be putting out in the next few months as well. So stay tuned. So thanks everybody for bearing with me while I have these technical difficulties. Here's the URLs, and this is for kicking off Lexi's talk, some sheep and some solar here. And I think on the next slide, I think my email is there. I'm happy if people are interested in further discussion, and I'll also be here for the rest of the morning. So thank you.
Bernie, I'm going to ask you to unmute. So are there any comments you'd like to share from the chat?
Yes, we've had kind of an active chat session going on as Audrey spoke. One of the big questions, and we promised both Lexi and Audrey from New York that we would not expect or ask them to be experts on Connecticut law and practice, but I think it's a fair question to say that we have over here the Connecticut Siting Council, which has jurisdiction, as you said at the top, Mark, for any installation over 1 megawatt. And so there's, I think, curiosity on how our neighbor to the west has their regulatory structure to fill this. I think it's, from what we've talked about in our prep sessions, it's a much more liberal framework, regulatory framework than here. We're not going to have the debate on this session, but it would be good to have a point of reference from New York on how the siting is done there. And one just came up. Okay, I'll come to that in a second. It appears that there is a paradigm shift if you think about how we here in Connecticut and they in New York have operated. We've been protective. So if we're agricultural or if we're city planners, we view to some extent the paradigm is that solar is something that needs to be protected against. And so Audrey set the groundwork for the idea that we have to site it properly, but we also need it. So the question becomes, can we start to actively court it and actually set goals to achieve it? And so that would be almost a paradigm shift from something we have to shelter ourselves from to something that we have to get enough of so that we can satisfy our regulatory goals by 2030 and 2050. And then most recently, the question came up about the cost of carports versus large-scale land arrays. Large-scale land arrays are so much less expensive than carports. So is there a way that we can structure outline the co-benefits? And Audrey started to do that when she started to outline the fact that it can be the base, a large carport can be the basis of a microgrid, can be sort of the foundational tenet of a microgrid. It can offer protection from the elements. It can offer low-cost car charging and enable the deployment of electric vehicles. So starting to spike out and be overt about the co-benefits, I think, is one way to balance the scale between the cost of a carport, which is necessarily higher because of the steel and engineering, versus the large-scale array. And we are also getting some interesting work from Judy Anderson, and who's citing the American Farmland Trust, who did a rough analysis of Connecticut and how much solar area will be needed and where it could go. So it sounds like already over here there is perhaps not to the same degree that Audrey and Scenic Hudson have achieved it, but the beginning of a proactive strategy to encourage solar and in a interactive way with agriculture. So there is the thought that in Connecticut we are losing farms at a rapid rate, and the hope, and Lexi will talk about how this is being done in the Finger Lake region of New York, that if we align renewable as an energy source with agriculture, we can actually economically preserve the existence of these farms, which often disappear, not for environmental reasons, but for economic reasons. We have Amanda Fargo Johnson is indicating that in 2017, Connecticut passed legislation where a system over 2 megawatts has to get approved before the Connecticut Siting Council and take into account advisement from DEEP and others. So we have a link in the chat to that. And I'm getting a couple, two references to the fact that solar arrays are being proposed or developed on cemetery land. I presume not at right over the grave sites, but to the extent that there is a large tract of land which is not totally used, I guess solar is being viewed as an appropriate, respectful alternative use for that land. I don't know if Emily Cole of the American Farmland Trust is on, but if she is, yes, she is. Marcus, I'm going to ask Emily to unmute, and perhaps she can give us an introduction to what the American Farmland Trust has done.
Hi, everyone. This is Emily. Can you hear me?
Emily, yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I can take a moment to share a little bit about what AFT is doing. We have a partnership. We're about to release some analyses for New England on smart solar siting, and we're working with Vote Solar, Acadia Center, Conservation Law Foundation, and the Vermont Law School. And we're actually looking at what land is available on contaminated acres, what land, what percentage of our needs that solar will likely feel can actually be met with that contaminated space. And then beyond that, we're looking at alternative siting like dual use, which Lexi will have some great things to say about the nexus of agriculture and solar siting and how that can really be a benefit. But what we're finding is that, unfortunately, we cannot meet all of our solar needs just on contaminated acres and rooftops and disturbed lands alone. And so AFT with this partnership is working on things that sound very similar to what Audrey was discussing about really smart siting and finding the best location, looking at alternatives that will be the least impactful. And part of that is for us looking at how to incorporate more dual use space where we have both agriculture occurring simultaneous with the clean energy production. And in each of the states in New England that we've looked at, there's not enough contaminated acres and rooftops to meet those goals. And so really being in this conversation together now about how to do it in the most environmentally responsible way is important. And so that's what we're looking at.
Emily, are you, as you conduct this analysis, are you putting it into, I'll say, a spreadsheet, or is your goal to sort of publish it as a report? Is there, I think the Connecticut folks on this call would be interested in keeping tabs on that. Hearing what you're saying, that there isn't enough, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't exploit every square inch of contaminated land that we can, so to take the burden off elsewhere.
We have analyses that will be standalone documents looking at what contaminated acres can hold. And yes, everyone should be explored that's possible. We absolutely agree. And then we'll also have a report that will pull all of this information together that will be released early this fall.
Well, that's good. And one of our hopes, and perhaps this has already happened, is I think we were so struck, all of us, when we saw the Scenic Hudson, the book that Audrey and company put together. We're kind of hoping that we start to form like a fibrous network of regional groups like this. So are you already in touch with Scenic Hudson, or is that something that we could hope to see come out of this video conference, that we start to work together to share ideas?
Sure, I do believe that our AFT New York office is in touch and has worked with Scenic Hudson before, but listening to Audrey, that's something that I would love to explore.
I'm not a person that believes everything good has to be made here, but it would be wonderful to have something akin to what Audrey put together. It's like almost the ultimate environmentalist coffee table book. It's just, as are her slides, just gorgeous to look at. And I think there's an element where having something like that is attractive. It helps us mainstream this idea. So it's not just environmentally aware people. We start to get more and more people on board.